Nothing about him stood out at first. That was the problem. No resistance. No hesitation. No visible adaptation. While others adjusted their language, their pace, their posture, he remained unchanged. Not defiant. Not passive. Just consistent. Consistency is invisible until it isn't. I noticed him because everyone else had already moved. Meetings sped up. Decisions compressed. Reactions sharpened. He didn't follow. He didn't oppose either. He continued at the same rhythm, as if the environment hadn't shifted. That kind of behavior doesn't trigger alarms immediately. It creates confusion. Systems are built to interpret reaction. Acceleration. Delay. Agreement. Objection. He offered none of these. When asked for input, he responded precisely, without urgency. When pressure increased, his output didn't. That was the first signal. Pressure usually produces movement. He absorbed it without changing shape. I began watching how people interacted with him. They didn't confront him. They circled him. Conversations adjusted around his presence. His stability disrupted flow without interrupting it. That's the most dangerous form of disruption. He didn't slow anything down, yet nothing moved cleanly past him. I checked whether he'd missed the signals everyone else had picked up. He hadn't. He saw them. He just didn't respond. Not responding isn't neutrality. It's refusal to validate the premise. Systems depend on validation. They escalate based on reaction. Without reaction, escalation loses meaning. I watched subtle attempts to provoke response. Slightly tighter deadlines. Framed urgency. None of it worked. He acknowledged everything and changed nothing. That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance or confidence. It was a different internal clock. His timing didn't sync with the system's acceleration. And misaligned timing is a threat. Not because it's loud, but because it exposes relativity. If one person can exist without reacting, then reaction isn't mandatory. That possibility is intolerable. I noticed the system begin to focus on him without admitting it. Requests routed through him more often. Expectations clarified. His behavior scrutinized not for errors, but for deviation. Deviation from what, exactly, wasn't clear. From momentum. From urgency. From shared anticipation. He didn't share it. He didn't reject it either. He simply behaved as if nothing had been decided yet. That posture destabilized everything built on assumption. I realized then that episode 8 wasn't about a breach or a mistake. It was about a contradiction. A living contradiction to the idea that acceleration was inevitable. The system didn't know how to correct him because there was nothing to correct. He met every requirement. He followed every rule. He just didn't react. And in a system that feeds on response, non-reaction is the most subversive act possible. I understood then why attention had shifted toward him. Not to punish. To understand. Understanding precedes intervention. The system doesn't move against what it doesn't yet comprehend. Episode 8 began quietly, as all dangerous things do. With a person who didn't signal fear, didn't signal urgency, and didn't signal agreement. Just presence. And presence, when it refuses to accelerate, forces systems to reveal what they can't tolerate. They didn't confront him. That would have been inefficient. Confrontation produces resistance, and resistance produces narrative. The system didn't want a story. It wanted a reaction. Something measurable. Something it could calibrate against. So instead of pressure, it applied stimuli. Small changes at first. Slight shifts in expectation. Requests framed as opportunities. Deadlines adjusted just enough to test elasticity. He noticed every change. That was clear. But he didn't mirror them. He acknowledged, complied where required, and continued at the same pace. That was the first failure. Stimulus without response breaks the feedback loop. Systems rely on loops. Without them, escalation becomes guesswork. I watched how the attempts became more deliberate. Tasks designed to force prioritization. Choices framed as urgent trade-offs. He made them calmly, without accelerating. Calm under forced urgency is destabilizing. It suggests that urgency isn't real. That suggestion alone is dangerous. I noticed how others reacted to his non-reaction. Not with anger. With discomfort. His behavior made their adjustments feel performative. If he could remain unchanged, why were they contorting themselves? That question didn't need to be asked out loud. It spread through posture, tone, hesitation. The system noticed that too. The goal shifted subtly. It was no longer about understanding him. It was about provoking differentiation. If he wouldn't speed up, maybe he could be slowed down. Or isolated. Or reframed. I watched an attempt to box him in procedurally. Additional check-ins. Redundant approvals. Layers meant to create friction. Friction usually produces irritation. Irritation produces reaction. He accepted the layers without complaint. Process didn't bother him. He moved through it exactly as before. That's when the system lost another lever. You can't exhaust someone who doesn't measure time the same way you do. I realized then that his stability wasn't passive. It was structured. He wasn't resisting acceleration. He was operating on a different axis entirely. That made him unreadable. Unreadable things invite projection. I noticed people beginning to assign intent to his behavior. He's waiting for something. He knows something. He's trying to make a point. None of that was true. But intent filled the gap where reaction should have been. That's the danger of non-reaction. It forces others to invent meaning. Invented meaning escalates faster than facts. The system responded by narrowing his field. Not as punishment. As containment. Fewer variables. Clearer scope. He accepted that too. Scope didn't define his output. Time didn't either. I watched a critical moment where urgency peaked around him. A decision needed alignment. Everyone else adjusted instantly. He didn't. He delivered his input when it was ready, not when it was demanded. The decision moved forward anyway. That should have resolved it. But it didn't. His input arrived afterward, unchanged. Accurate. Relevant. It exposed the artificial nature of the urgency retroactively. That's when the system registered threat. Not because he blocked action, but because he undermined its justification. Justification is fragile. It depends on shared belief. His timing broke the illusion that speed was necessary. I noticed how the system stopped trying to trigger reaction and started trying to explain him. Explanations are the precursor to classification. Classification leads to strategy. I saw language shift around him. An outlier. A special case. Not representative. These labels weren't insults. They were tools. Tools to separate him from the rest. Separation reduces contagion. That's when I understood the real risk. If his behavior spread, acceleration would lose authority. Others might realize reaction was optional. The system couldn't allow that. It didn't need him to change. It needed him to remain singular. I watched how attention consolidated. Eyes followed him longer. Questions lingered. Not about his work, but about his timing. Timing had become the issue. Timing is how systems enforce rhythm. He refused to sync. And refusal without defiance is the hardest thing to correct. I realized then that episode 8 wasn't about forcing a response. It was about defining what non-response meant. The system needed to decide whether he was an anomaly to be tolerated, or a precedent to be eliminated. That decision hadn't been made yet. But the attempts to trigger reaction had failed. Completely. And when a system exhausts its tools without results, it doesn't escalate emotionally. It escalates structurally. The next move wouldn't involve pressure. It would involve context. Redefining where he belonged. And once context changes, reaction becomes irrelevant. Episode 8 was approaching the moment where non-reaction would stop being a mystery and start being a category. And categories, once created, rarely remain neutral. The shift was subtle, but definitive. They stopped asking why he didn't react and started deciding what that meant. That's the moment behavior becomes classification. Classification is safer than interpretation. It removes ambiguity. Ambiguity invites delay. The system doesn't tolerate delay once it has named something. I noticed the language change first. Not in meetings, but in summaries. He wasn't described by actions anymore, but by traits. Low responsiveness. Stable output. Atypical pacing. None of these were criticisms. They were descriptors. Descriptors turn people into variables. Variables can be managed. I watched how his work was reframed. No longer evaluated against urgency, but against consistency. That seemed generous. It wasn't. Consistency is how systems isolate without confronting. By redefining expectations, they make deviation invisible. He didn't resist the reframe. He didn't acknowledge it either. That neutrality confused people at first. Then it reassured them. The category held. Once held, it justified itself. I saw how others were compared to him quietly. He's different. Different isn't exclusion yet. It's preparation. Preparation for separation that doesn't feel hostile. I noticed how his access patterns shifted. Still complete, but rerouted. Still included, but less central. Centrality is where influence hides. Removing centrality doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like optimization. I realized then that non-reaction had been neutralized not by force, but by containment. His behavior no longer challenged acceleration because it had been positioned outside the rhythm entirely. He was no longer part of the beat. He was background. That's when I understood the system's genius. It didn't need him to react. It needed others to stop measuring themselves against him. Categorization accomplished that. He became a reference point instead of a model. References don't spread. Models do. I watched how people stopped glancing at him during moments of urgency. He was no longer relevant to the decision-making tempo. That irrelevance was the goal. It protected acceleration from comparison. I thought back to earlier episodes, to memory being reclassified, to limits being isolated. This was the same maneuver, applied to behavior instead of information. The system had learned to absorb contradictions by labeling them harmless. Once labeled, they lose disruptive power. I realized the danger wasn't that he'd been categorized. It was that categorization felt reasonable. No one objected. No one needed to. The environment adjusted smoothly. That smoothness is always the signal that something irreversible has occurred. I watched him continue as before. Calm. Precise. Unchanged. But now his steadiness no longer registered as resistance. It had been domesticated. That's the quietest form of defeat. Not being forced to change, but being prevented from maturing. I noticed how quickly the system moved on. New urgencies. New accelerations. His presence no longer slowed or questioned anything. That absence of effect was celebrated silently. I realized then that episode 8 wasn't about a person who didn't react. It was about what happens after the system decides how to interpret non-reaction. Interpretation ends uncertainty. Once uncertainty is gone, so is curiosity. And curiosity is the last space where alternatives survive. I asked myself whether he noticed the shift. Of course he did. Non-reactive doesn't mean unaware. It means unwilling to validate the premise. But awareness doesn't grant leverage once context has been reassigned. He remained present, but the frame around him had changed completely. I understood then that the next phase wouldn't involve him directly. The system had solved the problem. Or so it believed. But categorization has a cost. It teaches the system how to neutralize non-reaction. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It waits. And the next time someone fails to react, the response will be faster. Cleaner. More confident. Episode 8 had crossed into dangerous territory. The system had learned something new about itself. And systems rarely learn without applying that lesson again. The question now wasn't what would happen to him. That was already decided. The question was what would happen the next time someone else refused to move at the system's pace, now that non-reaction had a name. Once the category existed, it stopped belonging to him. That's how you know it's complete. Categories aren't designed to explain the past. They're designed to manage the future. I noticed it the first time the label appeared without his presence. Someone else was described using the same language. Low reactivity. Stable pacing. Out-of-sync responsiveness. The words slid into place effortlessly, as if they'd always been there. No explanation followed. None was needed. The category carried meaning now. Meaning that justified action without discussion. I watched how quickly it was applied. Not aggressively. Efficiently. The moment someone failed to match the prevailing tempo, the label hovered nearby, ready to be used. This wasn't punishment. It was prevention. The system had learned how to neutralize non-reaction before it became visible. I realized then that this was the real escalation. Not isolating one person, but creating a template. Templates are how systems scale behavior. Once you have a template, you don't need to understand the individual anymore. You just check for fit. I saw how managers referenced the category indirectly. We need someone more dynamic here. This role requires responsiveness. These phrases sounded neutral. Professional. But they carried the weight of classification. They set expectations that excluded certain rhythms without naming them as such. That's how systems discriminate without appearing to. I noticed how people began adjusting preemptively. They sped up not because they were asked to, but because they didn't want to be categorized. Fear of the label spread faster than the label itself. That's how normalization completes. I watched someone who had once been thoughtful begin to rush their responses. Another stopped pausing before speaking. The system didn't need to enforce acceleration anymore. It had outsourced it to anxiety. I realized then that the original non-reactive individual had served his function. Not as a threat, but as a prototype. The system learned from him. It didn't need to keep him central anymore. It needed the lesson he provided. That lesson was now portable. Reusable. Applied wherever rhythm deviated. I noticed how quickly discretion disappeared. Before, timing had been flexible. Contextual. Now it was standardized. Deviations flagged automatically, not by people, but by expectation. Expectation had been codified. I saw it in performance language, in planning documents, in offhand comments that carried new meaning. Speed was no longer just preferred. It was assumed. Anyone who didn't match it had explaining to do. I realized then that non-reaction had been reframed as inefficiency. Inefficiency is the most dangerous accusation in a system that worships momentum. It doesn't need moral judgment. It justifies removal on technical grounds. I watched how decisions became easier after that. Faster. Cleaner. The complexity that non-reactive behavior introduced had been eliminated. Not by change, but by categorization. The system felt lighter. That lightness was celebrated. No one asked what had been lost. Loss is invisible when it's reframed as optimization. I understood then that episode 8 wasn't about suppressing difference. It was about eliminating alternative tempos. A system that allows only one rhythm eventually forgets that others ever existed. That forgetting isn't accidental. It's strategic. I looked at the original non-reactive individual again. He was still there. Still precise. Still calm. But now he existed as an example, not a challenge. The system no longer watched him with curiosity. It watched him with confirmation. Confirmation that the category worked. I realized then that reuse was the point all along. Once something can be reused, it stops being controversial. It becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get questioned. It gets maintained. Episode 8 had crossed into its most dangerous phase. The system wasn't reacting to non-reaction anymore. It was designing against it. The next step wouldn't be classification. That was done. The next step would be preemption. Ensuring that non-reaction never reached visibility again. And that meant the final part wouldn't focus on behavior at all. It would focus on selection. Who was allowed into spaces where tempo was set? Who never got close enough to be measured? Once selection replaces correction, the system no longer needs to learn. It only needs to filter. And filters, once installed, rarely get removed. The most effective decisions are the ones that never need to be defended. That's what filtering achieves. It removes the need for reaction by preventing exposure in the first place. I noticed it when certain people simply stopped appearing in critical spaces. Not removed. Not excluded. Just never considered. Their absence wasn't explained because absence didn't require justification. Selection had moved upstream. Before behavior could be evaluated, before timing could be noticed, the system had already decided who belonged in environments where rhythm mattered. That decision was quiet. Embedded in criteria. Wrapped in language about fit, readiness, adaptability. None of it referenced speed directly. It didn't have to. Speed had already been normalized as the baseline. I watched how new opportunities were framed. Roles described with urgency baked in. Expectations implied acceleration without stating it. Anyone who didn't resonate with that language self-selected out. Filtering works best when it feels voluntary. I realized then that the system had learned to eliminate non-reaction without encountering it. That was the refinement. No more classification after the fact. No more containment. Just prevention. I noticed how interviews changed. Questions shifted away from competence and toward tempo. How do you handle fast-paced environments? How do you prioritize under pressure? These weren't neutral inquiries. They were tests of rhythm. Wrong answers didn't disqualify candidates explicitly. They redirected them elsewhere. That's how filtering avoids conflict. No one is rejected. They're simply guided away. I watched how teams became more homogeneous in pace. Differences in timing disappeared. Not because everyone became faster, but because only those already aligned remained. The system didn't need to enforce speed anymore. It had curated it. I understood then that non-reaction had become unobservable. Not because it stopped existing, but because it never entered the frame. Anything that couldn't sync was screened out early. That's when systems stop learning. Learning requires exposure to difference. Filtering removes difference before it can register. I noticed how the language of improvement shifted. Instead of, how can we adapt, it became, how can we scale? Scaling assumes uniformity. Uniformity eliminates friction. Friction is where alternatives hide. I thought back to the original non-reactive individual. He wouldn't pass these filters now. Not because he lacked skill, but because his timing didn't advertise urgency. He would never be selected into the spaces that mattered. The system wouldn't need to neutralize him again. It had evolved past that stage. I realized then that episode 8 wasn't about one person or one behavior. It was about a closed loop. A system that had learned to protect itself from being challenged by simply not letting challengers in. That protection felt rational. Efficient. Even ethical, when framed as alignment. No one was harmed directly. No rules were broken. And yet, something essential had been lost. The possibility of operating at a different pace. The option to not react. That option had been filtered out before it could be tested. I watched how calm returned once again. Decisions smoother. Fewer delays. Less friction. That calm was convincing. It always is. Calm is the reward systems give themselves when they've reduced variability. But variability is where resilience comes from. Without it, systems become brittle. I wondered whether anyone noticed. Probably not. Filtering doesn't announce itself. It just makes certain futures impossible without anyone feeling responsible. I understood then that the final stage wouldn't involve confrontation, exposure, or correction. It would involve inheritance. A generation that never learned non-reaction was an option. A culture that equated speed with competence from the beginning. Episode 8 was approaching its conclusion. Not with a collapse, but with closure. The system had sealed itself. Not against threats, but against alternatives. And once alternatives are gone, stability becomes fragile in ways no one remembers how to fix. It didn't vanish suddenly. There was no moment where non-reaction was banned, corrected, or publicly rejected. It simply stopped appearing. That was the most reliable indicator that the system had completed its adjustment. When something no longer needs to be addressed, it means it has already been designed out. I noticed it in the rhythm first. Meetings moved with uniform cadence. Responses arrived predictably. No one paused long enough to unsettle the flow. The absence of hesitation felt clean. Efficient. Almost reassuring. That reassurance was the warning. Non-reaction had not been defeated. It had been rendered impossible. I looked for it deliberately. In conversations. In decision points. In moments where urgency once provoked alternatives. It wasn't there. Not because people were reacting better, but because only those who reacted correctly were present. Filtering had done its work. The system no longer needed to interpret silence, stillness, or refusal to accelerate. Those signals never entered the environment. I realized then that the original non-reactive individual was no longer relevant, even as a reference. The category that once contained him had served its purpose. Categories are temporary tools. Once behavior is eliminated upstream, classification becomes unnecessary. The system didn't remember him. It didn't need to. Memory is only required when repetition is possible. Here, repetition had been prevented. I watched how new members entered the system. They arrived already synchronized. Not trained. Selected. Their instincts aligned with the prevailing tempo. They didn't need instruction to move quickly. Speed felt natural to them. Non-reaction wasn't an option they considered because it had never been modeled. That's how disappearance works. Not by suppression, but by absence of example. I realized then that this was the final refinement. The system no longer reacted to difference. It no longer classified it. It no longer contained it. It ensured difference never reached visibility. That's the point where systems stop evolving. Evolution requires variation. Variation had been filtered out. What remained was stable, predictable, and fragile in ways no one could articulate anymore. I noticed how calm everyone felt. Calm is persuasive. It convinces people that nothing important is missing. The system functioned smoothly. Decisions flowed. Outcomes aligned. There was no obvious cost. That's why this stage is so difficult to challenge. There's nothing to point to. No victim. No failure. Just a narrowing of what's possible. I thought back to the early moments of episode 8, when non-reaction had still been confusing, even unsettling. That confusion had been productive. It had forced the system to reveal its limits. Now those limits were hidden again, not because they'd expanded, but because the conditions that exposed them no longer existed. I understood then that the disappearance of non-reaction wasn't an accident. It was the system protecting itself from uncertainty. Uncertainty slows things down. Slowing down invites reflection. Reflection invites alternatives. Alternatives threaten momentum. Momentum had won. The system felt complete. That feeling was its most dangerous state. Completion implies no further adjustment is needed. I realized that anyone entering this environment now would assume this was normal. They would never know another rhythm had existed. They would never ask why reacting was mandatory. Mandatory things rarely get questioned. They get inherited. Episode 8 didn't end with confrontation or revelation. It ended with normalization of absence. Non-reaction wasn't punished. It was forgotten. And forgetting is always more final than removal. Because removal leaves a trace. Absence, when normalized, leaves nothing to remember. I remained aware of what had disappeared. Awareness doesn't restore what's gone. It only preserves the knowledge that something once resisted. That knowledge had no place here anymore. It wasn't actionable. It wasn't useful. It didn't accelerate anything. And in a system that equates movement with value, that was enough to ensure it stayed quiet. Episode 8 closed not with loss, but with silence where an option used to be. The most unsettling part wasn't that the system had won. It was that it no longer needed to try.